I should have.
To be announced just doesn't bring them in.
No, it doesn't.
Like Dancing Girl.
Exactly right. Dancing girls would be good. Yes.
Maybe had the U.S.
Or dancing guys. Maybe that would be even better. Don't want to eliminate half the population. You know what I'm saying? Okay. David.
Think so, yeah.
David Clark.
Yeah, my daughter and I are going. My wife doesn't care a thing for it, but yeah. That'll be fun. Her spring break is, she's a freshman at Georgia State, and so it's the beginning of her spring break.
We hear from the generals all the time. It'd be nice to hear from the enlisted folks. No. I don't think we should wait. Shaw Blackman and David Clark are both coming. So we give them one more minute and we'll start. Order. Kind of a motion to start the meeting.
Motion.
Second? Second. All approve, say aye. Aye. I'd like to have Representative Heath Clark with our invocation, please.
Father God, we thank you so much for loving us. We thank you for demonstrating that love for us by sending Jesus to die for our sins. And we just pray that as with this working group, that we would take care of the men and women who put on the uniform and defend our freedoms, that we would make sure and ensure that as a state we are taking care of them and their families as they serve in our great state. God, we love you. Again, we thank you for this work, and we thank you for the privilege and honor it is to do this work. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you, sir. Just wanted to go through the agenda one by one. Appreciate everybody being here today. The first thing I'm going to talk about is we've had 3 installation visits: Fort Gordon, Fort Robins Air Force Base. I'm sorry, Fort Gordon, Moody Air Force Base. Fort Stewart was today, and I think that was a great job Representative Al Williams did. Nobody doesn't like Al Williams, so he was pretty good today. And then we have Robins Air Force Base, 22 March. Is that correct? Yep. Okay. Thank you, sir. And I think that's been good. I think the honor our military and talk about our different bases has been a good thing. That the General Assembly has seen that. The 14th of March next week is going to be Georgia National Guard Day as well. So that's going to be a big day as well for us. Why don't you also do number 3 on the item? I just found out just recently in the news press, and I want you all to be aware that North Carolina, the governor just put a $4 million a year into the budget to do what we're doing, military affairs. So North Carolina is definitely adding to their state budget on a line item. Every year they're going to be spending $4 million a year to do what we're doing here. This year, we have put about $2 million, believe it or not, about $2 million a year into this in the state budget, and I'm hoping we can increase that later on if we feel like we needed to. And of course, there's also a $50 million investment at Fort Gordon, so I'm very, very happy about that. I'll have to talk just briefly about the members' bills. It's hard to believe, but this committee, because of its work, has generated 12 different bills by 10 different legislators, and I just want y'all to be aware of that. I hope y'all will take that back to your constituency, and especially the chairman of the different bases, to talk about the different things we have done for the bases, and I think it's very important. The first one, of course, was Representative Terry England with a $50 million grant to Cyber Command at Fort Gordon. Representative Bill Hitchens, $1.5 million in veterans training officers, women's veteran coordinator, military support center. I got about $0.5 million competitive grant for counselors to K-12 education. Representative Mike Glanton, he's on this committee. He got the Educate Military Children Initiative. Representative Lee Hawkins did a homestead exemption for disabled veterans. Thanks, Chairman. You want to join us up here, sir? Thanks, sir. Appreciate Chairman Knight joining us. We'll be talking about a lot about DNR today, so wanted to talk about that and have him join us. Thank you, sir, for doing that. And I'm not going to go through all these, but I just want you, hopefully you'll talk about this to your constituents back home. And I think we should all be very, very proud, not just what we've done, but what our colleagues have done to help our military throughout the state of Georgia. I also want to add another one is House Bill 332, which is not on the agenda. It's a constitutional amendment, and Mark will talk about that later on. It's going to be a constitutional amendment to help with conservation easements around the bases for Georgia. The item number 6, the summer agenda. Right now, the speaker said we'll probably do. Who's number 16?
I am.
Representative.
Excuse me,
Prince?
Mr. Chair.
Yes,
Just
sir.
before you went on, and for the committee's clarification, on the 5 Alpha, you have the $50 million grant to Cyber Command at Fort Gordon.
Yes, sir.
Just for clarity, and it's my understanding that it is not a $50 million grant to the Cyber Center at Fort Gordon, because we're not giving money back to the feds. It's a $50 million grant to the region of Augusta to stand up a cyber exercise training facility.
Yes, sir.
I just wanted to make sure that was clear, so when people go back and brief, they make sure we're not giving monies back to the
Yeah,
feds.
thank you for that clarification. That's my fault. I apologize for that. But y'all are getting $50 million, so you're doing a pretty good job there, Representative Prince. Yes, sir. Thank you. Okay, the summer agenda. For sure, the speaker has talked about us going to Moody and to Kings Bay, and Representative John Corbett is going to be doing that visit. You want to talk about that at all, Mr. Corbett?
Thank you, Chairman Belton. Yeah, absolutely. What I've been in contact with Sheila McNeil down in St. Mary's Kings Bay Naval Base, trying to set up where we can do the Moody and the Kings Bay tour on consecutive days. Possibly go down like on a Tuesday to Kings Bay, do a reception that night, the next morning get up, do their presentation, and then trying to set up where we can take a tour of a submarine while we're there. Then get all that afternoon and then drive back to Valdosta, check into our motel, do a reception that night, and then the next morning get up and go to Moody and do the presentation there to complete the tour. I don't have those dates yet, but we're working on them. I told her any time starting we started in August last year. So I said, probably a good time to start it again. I know we got our caucus retreats and other stuff going on during July. So probably in August is what we're looking at.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think it'll be a great visit. And right now, the speaker does not have any other visits on the agenda. If you want to talk to the speaker, if you want us to go back to your base, we can. I'm certainly up for that. There'll be a conversation with the speaker. We're also planning on going to Washington D.C. And if you want to go to Washington D.C., please let me know. I don't know that all of us will go up there because it's a very expensive thing. But if you would desire to do that, so far we've got the okay by the speaker to do that, but I don't know that everyone will be able to go. So if you want to go, please let me know ahead of time. Representative Corbett.
Dates? Do you have any tentative dates on that yet?
Not right now, no.
That's would be.
Yes, sir. I'll work on that. Number 7 on the item is agricultural forestry initiatives, and one of the things we've learned is that a lot of states do a lot of different things with agriculture and forestry with the military in order to protect the military bases, especially with easements. Mark, you want to come to the podium and talk about that, sir? I've already got my pen on, actually.
I'm not sure if I left one in your space or not, Mr. Chairman, because I know we hit you up with one the other day, so I appreciate that. And I appreciate the opportunity, the invitation, Mr. Chairman, to come speak to the committee and the members. I do want to point out just real quickly that there are 3 things at your seats that I've provided. One is simply a packet in your envelope that are my speaking notes and a couple of maps that I'll refer to. And then I left my business card also at your seats. If I raise any questions in your mind, or you want to get with me at any time later, please feel free to do that. My cell number is on that card, so please holler at me if you want to. And then, of course, the lapel pins, which I left there, and you know, looking at the two gentlemen up at the top on the back row have already put their lapel pins on. I got to believe that if you wear that thing, it's at least likely to get you a few extra likes on your Facebook page. So, you know, I would encourage you to put those on if you have the time, and I appreciate that. Chairman asked me to come talk to y'all a little bit about what DNR is doing relative to being able to help buffer bases, help sustain their missions, and then even a little bit further than that, what, at least from our perspective, may be on the horizon to continue to further sustain those bases. Now, might seem a little bit odd to a few folks on the committee why DNR is coming to talk about military bases, but I assure you there is quite a bit of overlap in our missions. And if you're familiar with our mission, one of the primary purposes we have is to conserve, enhance, protect, and preserve natural resources, as well as cultural resources and historic resources. That actually ties in with part of the military mission, especially related to their environmental responsibilities. And the bases here in Georgia all have folks that are in an environmental wing or unit, and they work fairly closely with us on a lot of different levels. So I'll touch on a little bit of that, but specifically, we're currently involved with primarily, I'd say, 4 of the bases in Georgia more than some of the rest. The Townsend Bombing Range is probably the top one on our radar right now that we're working with most currently. Following that is certainly Fort Benning, and then Fort Stewart, and of course Robins Air Force Base. And I'm not trying to exclude the other bases, but those are the 4 that we're working the most in and around right now relative to buffer initiatives. And as I talk a little bit about programming and things that we're doing, understand that we're gaining a little bit more interest around both Fort Gordon and Moody Air Force Base through something that's known as the Gopher Tortoise Initiative. And, you know, since I brought that up, I would, if you look at, if you have this packet out, but if you look at that second to last page, that is simply a map of some units that we've identified that are highly important related to our management efforts on gopher tortoises. And you can see also that we've outlined where the military base is on there just today. So you can kind of see how our work around military bases will also help our gopher tortoise initiative. So let me talk just a little bit more about that. Why gopher tortoise initiative, and what the heck does that mean? In 2010, there was a petition to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which has responsibility for the management and the protection of threatened and endangered species in this country. And they listed a little over 400 species in their petition that they were telling the Fish and Wildlife Service, get on the stick, address these species, tell us what needs to be done. They have been sitting in your queue for a while, and you haven't addressed them. In Georgia, 122 of those species currently exist here. Now, what a petition does is it says, Fish and Wildlife Service, you got to take a look at these, and you got to make a call, a finding on whether they are threatened or endangered, and if so, what are you going to do about that? Well, when that happened, and of course it happened across the country, the Center for Biological Diversity filed this petition 6 years ago, red flags went up everywhere. And they certainly did for all state fish and wildlife agencies. One of the species on that list that does occur in Georgia was the gopher tortoise. And we got a bunch of them here. And a bunch of them are on private lands. A bunch of them are on military bases, along with things like red cockaded woodpeckers and indigo snakes and gopher frogs that all also occur on that list. But here's the deal. If we take a species that's in peril and suddenly he gets put as either threatened or endangered on that list, then there's all kinds of regulatory impacts that occur not just to the state, not just to the landowner, but also to every federal agency that spends dollars in our state or any state where they exist. So, when 122 species on it, we're trying to figure out, okay, what the heck can we do? And we know there's a lot of private landowners affected by gopher tortoises, and we know there's a bunch of them on a military basis. So that being a very prevalent species, and on top of that, one that if it's in existence, it's actually producing habitat or existing in habitat that's good for some of those others, like the indigo snake and the gopher frog, then we know we can take care of perhaps a whole host of those species on the list, secure their future, avoid some of those impacts to either development, economics, or just private personal property rights, whatever the case may be. So, saw an opportunity there to work with a lot of federal partners, number one, okay. And our Gopher Tortoise Initiative indicates where we got good populations of them and where we want to protect them. Now, when you couple that with the Defense Department's objective of sustaining bases and facilitating both training and defense missions, and you look at where gopher tortoises or some of these other species may exist, you figure out pretty quickly that there may be a partnership that comes into play. And being able to communicate with the Department of Defense, being able to communicate with some other partners, whether those are federal agencies, what we call NGOs, non-governmental organizations that have species-specific objectives, doesn't matter. We're looking for partners. So that kind of sets the stage. That's kind of how we're in this. We are the agency that protects natural resources, including wildlife. I, in fact, am the Assistant Director for Wildlife Resources Division, one of the divisions within DNR. And we take care of critters. That's what we do. So we're looking at threatened endangered species or those that are in peril, or even those that everybody likes to go out and take photographs of, and even more importantly in some of our minds, those that are economic incentive and boons to the state, like white-tailed deer, wild turkey, bobwhite quail, cottontail rabbits, and some others. But how are we specifically involved? There's just a few points I want to make here real quickly. First off, our Commissioner, Mark Williams, is a co-chair of a group that's known as the Southeast Regional Partnership for Planning and Sustainability of our Bases. That's a group put together that includes state agencies, or states rather, and those states are North Carolina, South Carolina, Florida, Mississippi, Alabama, and us. And then of course, others like U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and all of the branches of the Department of Defense. And I've listed under that, you can see what their mission is and what their vision is. But really, it's a group that gets together that talks about how do we sustain military bases and how do we sustain the things that they actually affect, like local economies, like being able to sustain things like agriculture that occurs around them when development and encroachment are the real risks and the hazards to a lot of those bases. So, as a co-chair, our DNR commissioner is in the middle of those talks every year about military bases in the Southeast, what's going on around realignment, where do the threats occur, what are the programs that we can bring onto the table to help avoid any of those potential negative impacts, and also where's the best bang for our buck? Where do we find partners? Regionally, locally, statewide, what are our best potential projects, and what would we put up for programs that the Department of Defense has to fund those kinds of programs. So what do they fund? There's a couple of actual programs, and I know I'm preaching to the choir here. I know y'all are familiar with them. You've heard them. REPI and ACUB are the two that we work with most, and our real estate unit works with most in order to fund land acquisition or fund conservation easements in order to buffer bases from encroachment. Of course, the Army program is the ACUB, and that's the Army Compatible Use Buffers.
If you could please, sorry,
Sure.
we're not familiar with these programs, so please,
Oh, I'm
REPI,
sorry.
ACOB.
Okay. Absolutely. All right. Yes, absolutely. These are Department of Defense programs that are funded annually at a certain level, appropriated by Congress, and are put into the military's budget to deal with threats to the boundaries of military bases. And most of that has to do with development and encroachment. When you look at training mission bases like Benning or the bombing range, where you have a lot of noise potentially going on, then encroachment is a bad thing, because then you have private landowners who are complaining about what's going on in the military base and potentially affecting their operations. And so the military looks to buffer their properties as much as they can, those bases, in order to reduce that kind of noise that may occur at the federal level in Washington. So the Army Compatible Use Buffers is one of those programs, and that is specific to the Army. And then there's the REPI program, which is Readiness and Environmental Protection Integration. And this is where you see a coming together of those military base missions that I talked about, whether it be training or defense, and then the environmental part of it. And a perfect example might be Fort Benning, where a couple of years ago, their training mission increased. They were bringing in more units, in particular tactical units associated with tanks, and they were having to do more development on their base. When they did more development, they were encroaching on species that their environmental services people had to account for, red-cockaded woodpeckers specifically. So what they were looking for were mitigation lands for the impacts, because the Federal Endangered Species Act requires mitigation, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service manages that, and Department of Defense has to account for it. So they look for partners. The military looks for partners. They reach out to, in particular, state fish and wildlife agencies like us to say, okay, where is an appropriate place for us to acquire lands that will support more red-cockaded woodpeckers, where we can establish populations, we can mitigate for the negative impacts that we're having on that endangered species without preventing us from more development on our bases in order to fulfill the mission. So we work pretty regularly with the military, the Army, the Air Force, the Marines. We also work with a lot of partners, some of whom are in the room today, like the Georgia Conservancy, the Nature Conservancy, the Orion Society. There's a lot of interested conservation partners out there to not only identify those properties, but also to help the Army acquire those properties, and then moving forward to manage those properties appropriately so that the species that are the target for that are actually going to inhabit and utilize that property, and therefore those populations will be okay. So that's kind of that's part of the Endangered Species Act that impacts federal agencies, including DOD, and how they spend their dollars and what they do on the landscape. And we're a partner in trying to help them maintain that. And we partner not just around Benning, but we have partnered also around many of the other bases, and I'll get to that. Of course, there's a couple of things relative to those programs, and each of the branches treats it a little bit differently, and that's match. It can't just be federal dollars that go into them. There has to be local skin in the game as well. That's the match. In many cases, that's state dollars, and in many cases, that is dollars from our conservation partners who help with that. And I have actually, and we'll get to it in just a second, but the last page in that packet that I gave you will show you some of the projects that we have engaged our partners in to do land protection around military facilities. This in particular is the U.S. Marine Corps Bombing Range, Townsend. And you can see there the number of partners that have kicked money in, not just the military, not just the state, but all of these private organizations as well, these nonprofit organizations who are throwing money in, everybody for their own reason, but it results in the same thing. So that's actually a good reference for a project, and we'll get to that in just a second. But the match is important, and that is probably the biggest limiting factor for Georgia and other states relative to trying to utilize these programs. I don't have to tell anybody on this working group how difficult it is to parse out state dollars every year through the appropriations process. It's a struggle every year, and you have to find places to put dollars, and everybody wants a piece of them. So that will give you just a little bit of a feel for why it's very difficult often for states to come up with match for these programs, and why it is so important for us to engage other partners, those that have similar missions to us. So again, we've partnered with a lot of folks. We've certainly partnered with DOD. I'm going to run through those 4 bases I mentioned up front just to give you a feel for what this means. You looked at that map just a second ago, the Townsend Bombing Range in Long County. I'm going to pull that out again. But since we started working with the Marine Corps on this project and looking in the Altamaha River Basin, which has a whole lot of reasons for us to be interested in conservation of the land as it deals with very pristine and intact river watershed and all the species and all the habitats go along with that, but it's primarily important to the U.S. Marine Corps and that bombing range. It's the only bombing range like it on the eastern seaboard. Otherwise, you got to fly 1,100 miles to go drop your bombs elsewhere. It's utilized by all the branches that fly planes and drop bombs or shoot something from those planes. And even more importantly, the mission of the bombing range has changed a little bit too. They are starting to engage in longer range weaponry, and in order to do that, they have to buffer themselves a little more. And so they have reached out in many cases to us as partners. The way it was put to me at one point was even smart bombs go dumb sometimes, and you need to buffer yourself a little bit better to overcompensate for any particular miscalculation. Not a hard thing to do in that part of the world because it is very sparse relative to human habitation, but there's a lot of opportunity there for conservation because of the numbers and types of species and the landscape and the habitats itself that are there, not the least of which, again, are gopher tortoises. So along Townsend, I think it's about 72,000 acres. The number's in here somewhere. 72,000 acres total. 72,500 acres have been conserved through programs to help buffer that range. We've been involved in about 59,000 acres of that. There's about 17 or 18,000 acres that are restricted strictly by the Marine Corps because of unexploded ordnance and other things. So this is an area, if you look at that conservation lands map and look at those green spots along that river corridor, this is an area that jumps right out at you in our state where we have worked very closely with U.S. Marine Corps. And relative to their partnership and what they are pitching in to help conservation, they're buffering their base. They've kicked in almost $53 million. State hasn't kicked in nearly that, but the majority of those lands come to us, sometimes in fee simple, sometimes in agreements for management, and then we take it from there to manage for species that are appropriate in those areas. So after that, Benning is probably our next most involved area relative to a base. I think everybody's fairly familiar with Fort Benning, but buffers there total almost $71 million total. Just lately, we've been very active because, and I mentioned red-cockaded woodpeckers, because of the impacts that their development has had on red-cockaded woodpeckers and their need to mitigate, we have actively engaged with them to purchase several properties, a total of almost 9,000 acres now. And in addition, we're managing others in coordination with the Nature Conservancy for specifically red-cockaded woodpecker management. Now, we are a land management arm of DNR, and we have multiple missions. One of those is access to public lands for wildlife-associated recreation and management of rare, threatened, and endangered species. But understand, if we take a piece of property on, we do multiple things with it relative to the citizens of Georgia. First and foremost, we are very focused on hunting and fishing. And because quite frankly, anglers and hunters are the ones who pay most of the management bill for us in this state. Of our budget in state dollars, it's about 82% of it comes from license fees currently. And so I think some of y'all may be familiar with House Bill 208 that has made its way through the House this year. Something like that is specifically focused at us being able to manage lands in coordination with DOD to meet their objectives. And we have to have those state dollars in order to do that and to utilize some of the excise taxes that we get. So anyway, Fort Benning, perfect example. We've even got our eyes on a property. Actually, it's Department of Defense has had their eyes on this property. They've negotiated with the landowner for 10 years, have become friends, and it looks like we eventually will end up closing on about 7,000 more acres adjacent. And that will go into our wildlife management area system as well for public access. We're not sewing up properties, nor are we foreclosing on properties. We are only dealing with willing sellers. And that is part of these programs. You in fact have to. So Fort Benning is another focus. Fort Stewart is one where in the past there's been some effort on buffer. Fort Stewart actually has a very active and very large environmental section on their own, and we've worked only peripherally with them on a few buffer projects, not very many acres, but we are very active with them in management of the wildlife on those properties. Their biologists and their administrators work very closely with ours. And we see opportunities for future proposals to go to the REPI program as well around Fort Stewart. And then last one I'll tell you about is Robins Air Force Base, which is kind of a one-off for us. Those of you who've been to Robins know it is much more suburban or urban than most of the other bases that we deal with through these programs. And it's really focused on small properties, probably primarily ones where people were living up until they decided to sell, and really is mostly focused on those small land holdings that are just north of the base at the north end of the runway and part of that flight corridor where there's a tremendous amount of noise of those planes coming in and out all the time. Now, that's not to say it's not an important project to us, because it is. We're partnering with one of the local regional associations to do that. And we are also going to be incorporating some of those properties once we do kind of a land switch deal with the regional association to attach it to one of our archery-only areas, the Etcheconney Wildlife Management Area. So it will meet our objectives. We're being a good partner with a regional association, and again partnering well with Robins Air Force Base. One thing I would really kind of leave you with, and while it's true that there is no dedicated funding source for land acquisition, which is what it would take relative to us kind of ramping up our efforts, There is no dedicated funding source for land acquisition in Georgia. I will tell you that we have been able to accomplish the things we do for one really two very good reasons. And those literally are our commissioner and our governor, who both recognize the value those military bases provide to this state, and have worked very hard with the General Assembly every year to try to find a few dollars to put in our bond capital outlays in order to provide the little bit of state match required to make those bigger purchases with the federal dollars, as well as the partners' dollars as well. Now, what does this look like in the future? What do we see kind of on the horizon? A little bit of a status quo, but I would point out to you, relative to our mission and resources available to us, we're probably doing just about all we can do. And this is not a plea for anything, so forgive me, but the reality is, in order for the state to move further down this road relative to buffer projects, you've got to have more dollars, and that's just the reality of it. Whether that occurs or not, I can't tell you. But I will bring to your attention something that the chairman mentioned a little while ago. This session, there was a House bill rolling through, House Bill 332, known as the Georgia Outdoor Stewardship Act. There's language in that bill that specifically references utilization of those dollars for buffering military bases. That is something I think this working group would take an interest in, and may want to pay a little more attention to if you haven't already been following what's going on with that. That's probably the primary thing that could happen. Relative to the department's ability to work, I can tell you this, and this is both personal to me as well as professional. I would like to thank everybody in this working group for assisting Chairman Knight in getting that House Bill 208 through the House anyway, because many of those dollars will also help, perhaps not as much in acquisition, but certainly the management of our state lands, which will hit the objectives that are important to the Department of Defense. So I'm certainly willing to answer any questions if you have any, but that's the sum total of what I have for you today.
Thank you, Mr. Whitney. And Chairman Knight, you want to address that very quickly? We only have time for questions, but we'll let you address that, Chairman. Thank you.
Regarding 208, Mr. Chairman.
Regarding anything you want to talk about, sir.
Well, I want to first of all thank Mark Whitney for coming. This all fits together, guys. We've talked about, first of all, 208, as y'all know, hunters and fishermen pay for our wildlife resources and the management of it. And it does it not only our license dollars, which must go back into DNR, or we will not be eligible for those excise taxes. As you've probably heard, the PR and DJ dollars that you and I, when we buy a gun or a fishing rod or ammunition, there's an excise tax at the manufacturing level that goes up to the Fish and Wildlife Service. And then it's allocated back down to the states, again, primarily based on our license numbers. So again, we've done, House Bill 208 is so very important to all of our hunters and fishermen. But as Mark has said, it also can go towards management and more access, okay, for our hunters and fishermen. And that's where we've got a good partnership, and it's not only important to this committee and what we're doing is looking at our bases. It's got a secondary mission of helping us, again, buffer these bases and then, again, help Georgia moving forward. Now, you had mentioned, Mark, the Georgia Outdoor Stewardship Act. I know, Leah, I don't want to put you on the spot, but guys, I want you to keep your eyes on this bill. I don't know if we got legs in it this session, but it's potentially coming up next year as a constitutional amendment that will allow some percentage of our sales tax on these things that we as outdoorsmen use, okay, to be dedicated to doing exactly what some of the things that Mark Whitney has mentioned, which is buffer land acquisition to buffer these bases. but it's a win-win situation for everybody. We win with our bases. We win with our sportsmen and women and just conserving land, conserving water, everything. And it truly is, I believe it's a mechanism we need to keep our eye on coming into next year, because I think it has very, very valid merit, not only for sportsmen and women who hunt and fish and enjoy the outdoors, but I think it is very, very, very much key to what we're doing here with our bases to make sure that we're following that mission of buffering these to make sure that we're keeping these very, very important bases in Georgia.
Thanks, sir. I wanted to point out there's a thing called the Florida Forever Act that they've put together. Conservation is a trust to help the military bases. They've set off 718,000 acres to protect their bases in Georgia, in Florida. So what I'm seeing from the numbers here, we've put about 157,000 acres in the Townsend bombing range, and about 29,000 acres at Fort Benning, about 29,000 Fort Stewart, a couple thousand at Robbins. This is Florida. It looks like they put more into it than we've done, a lot more, maybe double, maybe triple. North Carolina, they also have a program like this. They put $1 billion since 1996, 1,400 different projects. And they got, again, a $3.5 million in grants every year doing this sort of thing. So that's some serious money that these other states are doing. I got to show you a picture of, this is a picture of Hawaii, actually. And it's a picture of agriculture sitting next to the base. And that's a good thing, or forestry, the same way. This is all win-win for these. It protects these bases quite a bit, and I think we can do some of this in Georgia. How about Sentinel Landscapes? Can you talk about that, Mr. Whitney, a little bit?
I can talk a little bit about that. Sentinel Landscapes is a military program that helps states identify areas that will serve the exact purpose that we're talking about. Conservation benefits as well as sustainability of our military and their mission. And it's purely a way to show via map on the landscape those areas that would be the highest priority for a state. And what that does in particular for a group like talked about SURPASS that the commissioner serves as a co-chair on, is understand where the most important places to put these limited dollars is. And there are several states that have already identified Sentinel Landscapes. Georgia is one that currently has not, but groups like SURPASS, many of our conservation partners, and DNR are talking about as a potential program for us to get involved in.
So, any questions from the committee? How about conservation easements? What are we doing on that issue?
There actually is a conservation easement program that is authorized by the legislature, in fact, in law, in the state of Georgia, and it has been a very active program. In fact, it was scheduled to sunset, I believe, last year. And this body, the General Assembly, extended that sunset for, I think, another 5 years it was. DNR does have a role to play in that. There are eligibility requirements in order for someone to get a tax credit through a conservation easement, and one of those has to do with important habitats and important species. What DNR does relative to at least those eligibility requirements is we verify whether or not a particular application will meet one or more of those criteria, and we will issue a letter to that fact. It's still up to State Properties Commission to approve those, and also to approve what the tax credit will be. but we have somewhat of a role, and we certainly serve that as applications come across and through our office.
Chairman Knight?
I think, again, the Georgia Stewardship Act, this bill that is being worked on, and hopefully we'll see more of next year, has a component to these conservation easements. And Leah, I don't know, Mr. Chairman, Leah may have some more detailed information on that, but again, whether we're acquiring this land through WMAs or we're going out and specifically here, we're doing conservation easements, to help with the buffer or private land to make sure that the land's not developed, we're still meeting everyone's goal of conservation and wildlife and access, which I think is very important.
Would you like to add something to that? Sure.
Thanks for having me. So the Georgia Outdoor Stewardship Act, the way that it's structured currently in the current legislation, House Bill 332, would send the money to it that goes into the fund into 3 different buckets. One would be for acquisition of priority lands, so conservation easements, WMAs. The second bucket would be management of those lands that we own. And then the third would be a local matching fund for local cities and parks in cities around the state.
But my understanding, there is a military component to this. Is that correct?
Yes, and there
Yeah.
is a military component that kind of urges those in the first bucket to help with military-based buffering.
Yeah, and I think that's the piece that, Leah, I want to make sure that we focus on, because again, as
Yeah.
we come in and we're looking at protecting our bases, it's very important the state's role in this. I mean, it's huge, and I think we as conservationists, hunters, fishermen, I think we take big bites out of what we're trying to do to add and preserve, or not preserve, I don't like that word, conserve our land and our waters and wildlife, so that we can continue, our rich heritage of hunting and fishing and enjoying the great outdoors. So that's a big component of that bill. I like what we're seeing, and again, I would urge the committee members as we work through. I think this may address, Mr. Chairman, what you're talking about is we're in competition with these states. They may be already out ahead of us in funding a lot of these things, especially in regards to our bases and those buffering. This could be probably a win-win mechanism for a lot of people, and it could certainly boost us back up to the point where we're putting a lot more money into these, and we're meeting the needs of our hunters and fishermen.
Yes, sir. And one thing about the Townsend bombing range, you talked about, Mr. Whitney, but from the perspective, Secretary of Navy William Ball, he said that's one of the Georgia's biggest assets is having that big piece of land, because it's not just folks in Georgia are using it, but folks from Florida, South Carolina, Tennessee, North Carolina, they're all coming down to Georgia to bomb there, and it helps us, our military presence, a lot. Yes, sir. Representative Elam?
Mark, just looking back at your original comments, the very bottom of last paragraph on the first page said each branch treats match differently. The Marine Corps requires 50%, the Army 50%. And then later you said that Georgia hasn't really ponied up any money. So just clarify what you're telling me right there.
I would not say that Georgia has not funded up any money, because
Okay.
that would be an inaccurate statement if that is what I said, and I would apologize.
I apologize, Mr.
But without a dedicated funding source that you can kind of go to and count on, when those opportunities arise, you are continuously scrambling and trying to find funds that you can, which is why partners are so important in this process, because quite often they may have resources, financial resources available when that's not, as opposed to when you just happen to have it. But again, I would say the legislature, General Assembly, as well as the governor's office recognize, in particular, the importance of military bases and have time and time again, come up with funds in bond projects in order to help with the projects. So, the problem, more than anything else, is reliability. And you
Okay.
don't know, when you're parsing those dollars out,
Okay.
you guys are trying to figure out, who's getting the dollar and who's getting shorted this year. Those are hard choices to make.
Okay.
And so there's not. Those are almost more discretionary than anything else.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, relative to conservation easements, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that there's a lot of type of easements that are utilized in these projects. If you look at that Altamaha River map, you'll see a DOT mitigation site. Those are federal dollars that are purchased because of their impacts relative to wetlands. NRCS is a partner in Surpass. They have wetland mitigation programs like WIP, and they have EQIP programs. We are trying to grab any particular applicable program that we can to apply to these situations. But again, the ability to have a dedicated source that you can go to if something becomes available. Because again, we're only dealing with willing sellers. If someone, and in particular, there's a lot of people out there that want to see their land conserved. Grandfather's farm, they want to see it stay the way it is. So those are the types of properties we're here for.
Okay, thank you. Really appreciate time, and I do want to be conscious of everyone's time. But any other questions, very quickly, before we move on? And Chairman, you and I will talk a lot about this because there's a lot of opportunities here. The eighth thing on the agenda I'd like to talk to you just briefly is we're going to use the $0.5 million a year for school counselors. We want to try to create what a military-friendly K-12 school would look like. So I've jotted down things here that I heard from the TSCG, the USG, things that we heard from them to make them the award winners to make them military-friendly schools. Is there anything in here y'all do not like as a committee, or anything that you think we can add to this list of what we would want? So my idea is to see if we can create a military-friendly designation for K-12 schools in Georgia, and what would that look like? Any comments from the committee? Representative Prince?
Question.
Yes, sir.
This military-friendly, this designation, does there have to be, or have we decided, is there going to be a certain percentage of the students from military families? Again, I guess my question is, how do we define those schools that we will
My
sort of
idea would
support?
be to say, if you want a military-friendly designation, you'd have to do a certain number of these things, and then we would say, yes, you are a military-friendly school. That would be but I'm up to suggestions.
Again, I'm just worried about those that, and I know we put a bill in this year about more counselors for those schools with military.
That's right.
So those schools that are struggling that do, again, how do we identify a military school?
What I would
That's the
want is
question.
schools to do these things, and if they did these things, we would call them a military-friendly school. And to that point, that money for those counselors, I would hope they would do these things when they put their package forward to say we want one of those counselors, and hopefully the pilot program will increase to the point where we have lots of money for lots of counselors, and a lot of schools around the military bases will get them. Now, obviously, we're not going to give military-friendly counselors to people who are not around military bases. There's got to be around a military base.
Yeah, but I think this year, or maybe one of your bills, I'm not sure, but sort of opens up the schools, at least the public schools, to military folks who, they can attend wherever school they want to.
That's right.
So with that being said, a school may not be the assigned school of that base or things like that, but we do have military students, based on the bill, being able to attend.
That's right.
So, and again, I just want to make sure we think this through when we
So what's your suggestion then? I'm all with the suggestions. here.
Again, I'm asking a question now.
Okay.
Maybe we need to talk about this a little more later.
Are you taking action on this?
We're not taking action on today.
Okay, yeah, well, we can
but I
discuss
do
this
want to
later.
y'all to have this out here and think about it and discuss it amongst yourselves. Representative Elam?
I'm just clarifying that, obviously, it would, something's gotta have impact on what percentage of that school is a military dependent. This is a lot less money than we were talking about in the very beginning.
It is, yes.
So with this smaller amount of money, we obviously should be attacking those schools that have the largest,
Okay,
and obviously that would be, like the Marine Base, we wouldn't even be in the ballgame,
sure,
because we just have such a small percentage.
sure, okay.
So
I'll put that in there. Thank you. That's a good suggestion. Thank you. Any other suggestions? Okay, the last thing I want to talk about very briefly is Representative Elam has a bill. You want to talk about your resolution, Representative Elam?
it's just strictly a resolution.
I'll talk to the microphone, just so everybody here. You can talk to your microphone if that's fine.
Okay. Okay, we have the Georgia Adopt, the American Council of Education. It's just an organization that establishes things that states or institutions should do that would make them more friendly militarily. And so this resolution, it just says, whereas Georgia is home to more than 751,000 veterans, where it has more than 105,000 active duty military, whereas Georgia residents are separating service members would be able to pursue higher education, whereas separating service members have faithfully served the state of Georgia. Then at the very end, we're just saying that therefore be it resolved by the House of Representatives that the members of this body recommend that the higher learning institutions of Georgia adopt the American Council on Education criteria to allow separating service members to count applicable military training and experience for academic credit toward degree requirements. And that's the core right there.
So if you'd like to sign that resolution, you can talk to Representative Elam about that. Anything else for the committee? All right, well, thank you for your time, sir. Thank you.